We've discussed the concept of well-known ports in our TCP versus UDP video, and I want to follow that up with a bit more information here in regard to those well-known ports. So first, let's talk about port ranges. Our well-known port ranges are within the range of ports number 0 through 1023. This is where we commonly have network services such as DNS, DHCP, HTTP, and HTTPS, among others. There's another range for what we call registered ports, from 1024 to 49151. Registered ports are where a vendor or organization will register a protocol with the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, or the IANA. This is where vendors may have a specific port assigned to a protocol that they're using. And we also have something called ephemeral ports, also known as dynamic ports or private ports. We've talked about these as well, and they range from 49152 through 65535. By the way, the ephemeral ports aren't strictly adhered to. You might find a return port in the registered port range depending on the operating system. So if you're doing a packet capture and you do see that, don't be alarmed. But technically speaking, these are how the port ranges are divided up. Now let's talk about some specific well-known ports and protocols that we see within the well-known port range. Now, this list is by no means exhaustive, but these are some of the most common port and protocol combinations that you're likely to see, and also those that you're likely to leverage when you're performing ethical hacking and using tools found within Kali Linux. Now, if this is new to you, the best way to memorize some of these ports is through flashcards. That's what I would recommend, or a flashcard app such as Anki. That's spelled A-N-K-I. That's a really great free tool that is a digital flashcard application, and I've used that many times in my own studies to memorize some of these things that you just have to commit to memory. So let's go through some common protocols. First, we have FTP, File Transfer Protocol. This is used to transfer files with a remote host, and that typically requires authentication through user credentials. If you've ever uploaded content to the back end of a website, as an example, then you've likely used this. FTP uses TCP port 20 and 21. 21 is used to establish the connection, and 20 is used to transfer data. FTP does pass login credentials in clear text, or unencrypted in other words, so that is considered to be an insecure protocol. The next protocol that we'll talk about here is SSH, or Secure Shell. Now, this is a secure protocol. This is going to be used to connect to a host remotely over TCP port 22. You commonly see this used with a terminal emulator to connect to network equipment, such as a switch or a router. If you're familiar with the Cisco world, or if you've worked with Cisco equipment, this is a common way that we connect for management to those devices. We can also combine FTP and SSH, which gives us FTP, or File Transfer Protocol. We have that over a secure SSH connection, which is what we call Secure FTP, or SFTP. This is also used over TCP port 22. It's still using FTP, but we're sending that inside of SSH for protection. We also have FTPS, which is FTP secure. So what's the difference here? Well, instead of using SSH, as we see with secure FTP, to protect our FTP data, we're using either SSL or TLS. SSL is secure sockets layer, TLS is transport layer security. So we're using one of those two mechanisms to do that. TLS is the more secure version of this, and you see that this uses ports 989 and 990, and that can be either TCP or UDP traffic. An older protocol that's similar to SSH is Telnet. This allows us to remotely connect to a host using a terminal emulator. But just like FTP, this is also sent in clear text and it's unencrypted, so SSH is the preferred method over Telnet. Telnet uses TCP port 23 for communication. Next we have SMTP, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. SMTP is used for sending email to an email server over TCP port 25. SMTP by itself is not secure, so we alternately have SMTP over SSL or TLS. This provides either SSL or TLS security for our SMTP traffic. Again, with TLS being that more secure option. This uses TCP port 587. One of the most popular protocols that we use every single day is called DNS, Domain Name System. This allows us to resolve domain names to IP addresses. So when we're going out to google.com as an example, we communicate with a DNS server, and that's going to translate the domain name of google.com into the corresponding IP address for that web server. That uses port 53, either TCP or UDP. Another file transfer protocol is TFTP, Trivial File Transfer Protocol. This is a lightweight version of FTP that doesn't require any user credentials at all. So in other words, there's no authentication. You can download or upload using TFTP over UDP port 69. Next, we have DHCP, another very common protocol. If you don't have a static IP address that's manually set on your laptop or your desktop or even your phone, DHCP is used to try to automatically obtain IP addressing information. And that includes the IP address, the subnet mask, the DNS server's IP address, and the default gateway. And that takes place over UDP port 67. We also have HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. This is how we exchange information with a non-secured web server, and that happens over TCP port 80. Now, if we're making a credit card purchase online, or if we're sending other sensitive information to a web server, if we're logging into a website or our email account, that's no good. We don't want to use HTTP because it's insecure. Instead, we want HTTPS. This is a secure version of HTTP, and that's going to use SSL or TLS to provide security, and more commonly today we see TLS used for that. Again, that's a stronger protocol. This works over TCP port 443. A protocol that goes hand in hand with SMTP that we mentioned earlier is POP3. This retrieves email from a server. Remember, SMTP is used to send email to a server, whereas POP3 is one of the protocols for retrieving mail from a server over TCP port 110. One of the disadvantages of POP3 is that it's going to move email from the server to whatever device you're using. So for example, if you're reading email on your laptop and you retrieve email maybe through an Outlook email client using POP3, if you open your mobile phone and you open that same email client, that message is no longer on the email server, so you won't be able to retrieve this message on your phone. That's certainly an issue I've ran into when trying to use POP3, and we'll talk about the alternative to this in just a bit. POP3 also has a secure version over SSL or TLS, and that uses TCP or UDP port 995. Having the time in our network synchronized is also very important. If we want our logs to correlate to one another, that's critical. And so that can be communicated using the Network Time Protocol, NTP. We can synchronize the clocks on all of the devices in our network so that they're running exactly the same. That uses UDP port 123. Next, we have IMAP. This is the POP3 alternative that I mentioned. This allows us to view email on the mail server without removing that email. So essentially, we can have multiple identical instances of our inboxes on various devices. This uses TCP port 143. Just like POP3, this isn't secure by itself, but we can use that in combination with SSL or TLS over TCP port 993. Next, we have SNMP, Simple Network Management Protocol. This is a way that we can monitor or manage or even configure network devices. We use ports 161 and 162 to do that, either TCP or UDP. Another one I'll mention that's actually outside of the well-known port range is RDP, Remote Desktop Protocol. You can see that this uses TCP port 3389. So that is within the registered port number range. I know that's outside of the well-known ports, but I wanted to give you this example just to illustrate how those registered port numbers work. RDP, Remote Desktop Protocol, is very popular, and so you can see that this works inside of that registered port range because RDP has been registered as a dedicated port with the IANA. We also have a couple of voice over IP protocols that I'll throw out here, namely SIP and H.323. SIP uses TCP or UDP port 5060 and 5061, while H.323 uses TCP port 1720. Again, both of these are outside of the normal well-known port range, and they fall within that registered port range. So just a couple more examples of popular registered ports. And one last thing I'll mention is SMB, Server Message Block. This is a Microsoft protocol for sharing resources between devices, and that's done over UDP port 445. Originally, this used port 139, but in more recent versions of Windows, it uses port 445. This is one of the common ports that you would be interested in seeing as a pen tester. There have been numerous exploits over SMB, one of the most recent and popular being the ransomware WannaCry. This utilized SMB to populate throughout networks. So those are a few of the most commonly used well-known ports and protocols. Again, it's a great idea to commit these to memory in some way so that if those pop up during a pen test evaluation, you have a much better and quicker idea of what you're looking at. I'll reiterate the fact that utilizing flashcards, either normal flashcards or digital flashcards, are a very helpful tool to memorize this list and other things like that. This is not an extensive list by any means, but these are certainly some of the most common ports and protocols that you're likely to run across.